She stood there, invisible, as the seventh man walked past her without a second glance. 31 years old, too plain, too old, too... everything wrong. The platform was nearly empty now, and Lydia Hart knew what came next. The long, humiliating walk back to the boarding house. Another town crossed off her dwindling list of hopes. But then the ground trembled. Hoofbeats thundered down Main Street like a storm rolling in, and when the dust settled, the richest rancher in 3 territories stood before her. What he did next would shock everyone who'd ever dismissed her as unworthy. If you want to see how this impossible choice changes everything, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The autumn sun beat down on Dawson Creek with the kind of relentless heat that made even breathing feel like work. Lydia Hart stood at the far end of the wooden platform, her hands folded carefully at her waist, her posture perfect despite the burning in her lower back from standing so long. Around her, the other women fidgeted and preened, adjusting their bonnets, pinching color into their cheeks, whispering nervous prayers under their breath. Lydia did none of these things. She'd learned, after 6 rejections in 6 different towns, that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The platform had been erected 3 days earlier in the center of town, right in front of the general store where everyone could see it. Rough-hewn planks, still smelling of fresh pine, elevated 23 women above the dirt street like merchandise on display, which Lydia supposed was exactly what they were. Frontier brides, mail-order wives, women desperate enough to travel hundreds of miles for the chance, just the chance, of being chosen by a man they'd never met. Lydia was the oldest woman on the platform. At 31, she stood among girls barely out of adolescence, their skin still smooth and unwrinkled by hardship, their eyes still bright with the naive belief that marriage meant rescue. She'd been 19 once, standing on a different platform in a different town, believing the same beautiful lie. 12 years and 6 rejections later, she knew better. The first man arrived just after noon. He was a farmer, his hands permanently stained brown from working the soil, his face weathered and kind. He walked the length of the platform slowly, studying each woman with the careful attention of someone making an important investment. The younger women straightened under his gaze, offering tremulous smiles. He stopped in front of a blonde girl who couldn't have been more than 17. "What's your name, miss?" "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Sarah Mitchell." "Can you cook, Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes, sir. My mama taught me everything. Bread, stew, preserves, pie." "That's good, real good." He nodded, almost to himself. "I got 160 acres about 10 miles north, just me and my boy since my wife passed 2 winters back. I need a woman who can work hard and don't complain. You think you can do that?" Sarah's smile was radiant. "Yes, sir. I promise I can." "Then you'll do." Just like that. No courtship, no romance, not even a proper conversation. Sarah stepped down from the platform, her hand trembling as she took the farmer's offered arm, and they walked away together toward the preacher's house. 1 down, 22 women remaining. Lydia watched it happen with the detached observation of someone who'd seen this scene play out over and over. The selection process was always the same. The men wanted youth, beauty, or both. They wanted women who would be grateful enough to never question their authority, submissive enough to endure whatever hardships frontier life demanded without complaint. At 31, with unremarkable brown hair and a face that drew no second glances, Lydia offered none of what these men sought. The second man arrived an hour later. He was younger, probably not yet 30, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a ranch worker. His eyes skipped over Lydia without pausing and landed on a petite redhead near the front. The third man came just before sunset, a merchant who needed a wife to help run his store. He chose a quiet brunette who blushed when he spoke to her. The fourth and fifth men arrived together the next morning, brothers looking for wives to help establish their neighboring homesteads. They selected 2 friends who'd traveled together from St. Louis, girls who clutched each other's hands and wept with relief at being chosen. By the afternoon of the second day, only 8 women remained on the platform. Lydia knew she should feel something, disappointment perhaps, or renewed desperation. Instead, she felt only a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with standing in the sun for 2 days straight. You've done this before, haven't you? Lydia turned to find one of the younger women watching her with curious eyes. The girl was maybe 22, with honey-colored hair and a face that would have been pretty if not for the pockmarks scarring her left cheek. Pardon? Lydia kept her voice neutral. This, the bride platform. You're not nervous like the rest of us. You just stand there, like you already know how it ends. Lydia considered lying, then decided the girl would learn the truth soon enough regardless. 6 times before this. Different towns, same platform, same hope, same outcome. The girl's eyes widened. 6 times? And nobody chose you? Nobody. But why? You're not… The girl caught herself, her cheeks flushing. I just mean, you seem perfectly nice and you're clearly capable, and I'm old. Lydia said it without bitterness, stating simple fact. I'm 31 years old. Most of these men want wives young enough to give them many children and strong enough to outlast the hard life out here. At 31, I'm already approaching the age where childbearing becomes dangerous, where a woman's body starts to break down under the strain. I'm a poor investment. The girl looked stricken. That's a terrible way to think about it. Perhaps. But it's the way these men think about it, which is what matters. Lydia gestured toward the street, where another man had just arrived on horseback. Watch. He won't even look at me. She was right. The man, a blacksmith by the soot stains on his clothes, approached the platform and immediately gravitated toward the youngest women. Within 20 minutes, he'd selected a blue-eyed girl of 19 and led her away. 7 women left. The girl with the scarred cheek touched Lydia's arm. My name's Margaret. Margaret Finch. Lydia Hart. What will you do, Lydia, if nobody chooses you again? It was the question Lydia had been avoiding for the past 2 days. The truth was, she had no idea. She'd spent the last of her money on the train ticket to Dawson Creek. If this town rejected her like all the others, she'd have nowhere left to go. I suppose I'll figure that out when it happens, Lydia said quietly. The 3rd day dawned hot and cloudless. 4 more men arrived, and 4 more women left the platform. By afternoon, only 3 women remained. Lydia, Margaret, and a tall, stern-faced woman in her late 20s who hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. The town's matchmaker, a plump woman named Mrs. Henderson, climbed onto the platform with a forced smile. Well, ladies, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our scheduled appointments. If no one else arrives by sunset, we'll need to vacate the platform for the merchants' market tomorrow. Margaret's face crumpled. But what about us? What are we supposed to do? Mrs. Henderson's smile dimmed with something that might have been pity. The boarding house offers weekly rates if you'd like to stay in town and seek situations on your own. Or there's a westbound stage on Friday that could take you to… I'll take the room, the stern woman interrupted. How much? As Mrs. Henderson discussed rates, Lydia looked out at the town that had rejected her. Dawson Creek was bigger than most of the settlements she'd tried, prosperous enough to have real shops and a proper hotel, but prosperity hadn't made its men any more willing to choose a woman past her prime. She thought about the westbound stage. There were other towns out there, other platforms, other chances. But the thought of standing in the sun again, watching younger women get selected while men's eyes slid past her like she was invisible, made something inside her chest constrict painfully. Maybe it was time to admit defeat. Maybe it was time to stop chasing the fantasy of marriage and children and a home of her own. Maybe it was time to accept that some dreams simply weren't meant for everyone. Miss Hart? Lydia turned to find a young boy standing at the edge of the platform, his face dusty and his eyes bright with the importance of his errand. Yes? Mrs. Henderson said to tell you there's one more man coming. He sent word he'd be arriving late, but he's definitely coming. She said you should wait. Hope was a cruel thing. Lydia had tried to kill it, had thought she'd succeeded, but it flickered back to life at the boy's words anyway. Did he say anything else? About what he's looking for? The boy shook his head. Just that he'd be here before sunset and to make sure the platform wasn't taken down. After the boy ran off, Margaret moved closer to Lydia. Did you hear that? One more chance. One more rejection, more likely. But even as Lydia said it, she felt her heart beating faster. The afternoon stretched endlessly. The stern woman left to secure her boarding house room. Margaret paced nervously, smoothing her dress and checking her hair every few minutes. Lydia simply stood, watching the sun creep toward the horizon, trying not to think about what would happen when it set. Mrs. Henderson returned at 4:30, looking harried. "Ladies, I've just learned more about our final gentleman. I thought you should know what to expect." Margaret stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "His name is Caleb Rowland. He owns the CR Ranch. That's the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. Thousands of acres, hundreds of head of cattle, at least 30 men working for him." Mrs. Henderson paused as if weighing her words. "He's the wealthiest man in these parts, and he's looking for a wife." Margaret's eyes went wide. "The wealthiest? Then why would he need to come to a bride platform? Surely women would throw themselves at him?" "Yes," Mrs. Henderson agreed, "and many have. But Mr. Rowland is particular, very particular. He's turned down every woman in town, every introduction, every attempted matchmaking. We all thought he'd simply never marry." Lydia felt a familiar sinking sensation. "Then why is he coming here?" "That's what I'd like to know." Mrs. Henderson looked between them, her expression grave. "I'm telling you this because I want you both to understand. If Caleb Rowland chooses one of you, it won't be like the other matches. The CR Ranch is a massive operation. Being his wife would mean managing a household of 30 men, hosting important guests, making decisions that affect the entire ranch. It's not a job for someone weak or uncertain." Margaret swallowed hard. "What's he like?" "Mr. Rowland?" "Demanding, direct, not unkind, but not soft either. He's built an empire out here through hard work and harder decisions." Mrs. Henderson smoothed her skirts. "He's 42 years old, never been married, and by all accounts has no interest in romance or sentimentality. If he's finally decided he needs a wife, it'll be for practical reasons, someone to run his household and perhaps give him heirs to inherit the ranch." It was the most honest description of marriage Lydia had heard since arriving. No pretense of love or partnership, just the cold business transaction it actually was. Somehow, that made her straighten her spine. At least this would be honest. At least there would be no illusions to shatter. The sun was touching the horizon when they heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching fast. Lydia turned toward the sound, her heart suddenly pounding. A horse and rider came into view, moving at a full gallop down Main Street. People scattered from their path, and shop owners came to their doorways to watch. The rider was tall, sitting the horse with the easy confidence of someone born in the saddle. He pulled up directly in front of the platform in a cloud of dust that made Margaret cough. For a moment he sat there, silhouetted against the setting sun, and Lydia couldn't make out his features. Then he dismounted in one fluid motion, and she saw him clearly. Caleb Rowland was not a handsome man, but he was striking. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and lines etched deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the prairie sun. His hair was dark brown, threaded with gray at the temples, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested stubbornness as a defining characteristic. He wore dusty riding clothes, practical and well-made, but showing evidence of a long, hard ride. His boots were scuffed, his hat pushed back on his head, and there was something almost wild about him, like a man more comfortable on horseback in open country than standing in the middle of town. Mrs. Henderson hurried forward, her professional smile fixed in place. "Mr. Rowland, we're so glad you could—" He cut her off with a raised hand, his eyes already on the platform. On Margaret, who stood frozen at the front. On Lydia, who stood at the back. 2 women, 2 choices. Lydia forced herself to breathe normally. Caleb climbed the steps to the platform, his boots thudding on the wood. He moved past Mrs. Henderson without acknowledging her, approaching Margaret first. "What's your name?" His voice was deep, roughened by wind and weather. Margaret Finch, sir." She curtsied awkwardly. "How old are you, Margaret Finch?" 22, sir." "Why are you here?" The question clearly startled her. I need to marry, sir. My father passed, and my brother couldn't support me, so I came west to—" "Can you cook for 30 men?" Margaret blinked. 30? I can cook, but I've never— "Can you manage household accounts, read and write, handle finances?" "I can read a little, sir, but I've never managed—" Caleb was already moving. He walked past Margaret, his eyes fixed on Lydia with an intensity that made her pulse race. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, his eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds. They studied her with unnerving directness, as if he could read every secret she'd ever kept. "What's your name?" he asked. Lydia's throat was dry, but she kept her voice steady. "Lydia Hart." "How old are you, Lydia Hart?" This was it, the moment every other man had turned away. 31. Something flickered in his expression, but it wasn't dismissal. "Why have you been standing on this platform for 3 days?" "Because I need a husband, and this seemed like the most practical way to find one." "That's not an answer. Why do you need a husband?" The question felt too intimate, too close to all the failures and losses that had brought her here. But something about the way he asked it, direct, not unkind, genuinely wanting to know, made her answer honestly. "Because the alternative is dying alone and forgotten in some rented room, working whatever jobs I can find until my body gives out and nobody notices I'm gone." The words came out harder than she'd intended. "Because I'm tired of being invisible. Because I want a home and children and a purpose beyond simple survival. And because I'm stubborn enough to keep trying even after being rejected 6 times in 6 different towns." The crowd that had gathered around the platform went silent. Even Margaret was staring at her. Lydia felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd said too much, revealed too much. But Caleb just nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something he'd suspected. "Can you cook for 30 men?" "I've cooked for work crews before, construction camps mostly. I can manage it." "Can you read and write, handle accounts?" "Yes to both. I kept the books for my father's store before he died." "Can you ride a horse?" "Yes." "Can you shoot a rifle?" That one surprised her. "If necessary." "It's necessary. The ranch is isolated. You'd need to be able to protect yourself if I wasn't there." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "Can you give orders to men and expect them to be followed?" Lydia thought about the construction foreman who'd tried to cheat her out of wages, the boarding house keepers who'd tried to overcharge her, the countless men who'd assumed she was weak because she was a woman. Yes. Even when they don't want to follow them? Especially then. For the first time, something that might have been approval crossed his face. "Mrs. Henderson said you've been rejected 6 times. 7, if you count this morning when the blacksmith chose someone else." "Why do you think that is?" The question was blunt, almost cruel, but Lydia met it head on. "Because I'm too old to be desirable, too plain to be decorative, and too honest to pretend otherwise. Men want wives who'll be grateful and submissive. I'm neither." "That's honest." Caleb crossed his arms, still studying her. "What makes you think I want something different?" "I don't know what you want, Mr. Rowland, but you walked past a younger, prettier woman to ask me these questions, so clearly you're not looking for the same things as the other men." Behind them, Margaret made a small sound of protest, but neither Caleb nor Lydia looked away from each other. "I don't have time for courtship," Caleb said bluntly. "The ranch requires constant attention, and I need a wife who can shoulder half that burden without complaint or resentment. I need someone capable, intelligent, and strong enough to handle a hard life without breaking. I need a partner, not a decoration." He paused. "I also need someone honest enough to tell me when I'm wrong, which doesn't happen often, but does happen." "That's a business proposition, not a marriage proposal." "It's both. The CR Ranch is my life's work. Any woman who marries me marries into that work. There's no separating the two." Lydia's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. This wasn't how she'd imagined this moment, standing in front of a hard-eyed stranger who talked about marriage like a business contract. But it was also more honest than any other proposal she'd witnessed in 3 days. "What exactly are you offering, Mr. Rowland?" "A week," he said. "You'll stay at the boarding house, supervised and respectable. During that week, you'll visit the ranch, meet the men, see what the work actually entails. At the end of the week, if we both agree we can build a partnership, we'll marry. If either of us has doubts, you'll take the next stage to wherever you want to go, and I'll pay your fare plus enough to get you settled." "Why a week? Why not just choose now like the other men did?" "Because I'm not other men, and this isn't a simple choice." His gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm offering you a hard life, Lydia Hart. Beautiful in its way, but hard. I won't lie to you about that. You deserve the chance to see it clearly before deciding. The crowd around the platform had grown, dozens of people pressing close to hear every word. Lydia was aware of their stares, their whispers, the shock on their faces that Caleb Rowland, the wealthiest man in 3 territories, had passed over a younger woman to stand here offering terms to the one everyone else had rejected. And if I say yes to this week, what exactly would be expected of me? Honesty, hard work, a willingness to learn, and at the end, a clear answer, yes or no, with no games or pretense. It was the strangest courtship offer Lydia had ever heard. No promises of love or happiness, no flowery words about building a future together, just honest work and honest answers. She looked at Margaret, who was watching with wide eyes and obvious hurt at being passed over. She looked at Mrs. Henderson, whose expression showed clear calculation about the social implications. She looked at the crowd, at all the people who'd watched her stand on this platform for 3 days without a single man stopping to ask her name. Then she looked back at Caleb Rowland, at his storm-gray eyes and work-hardened hands, and the quiet confidence of a man who'd built an empire from nothing. "Yes," Lydia said, "I'll take your week." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. "Then you'll need to pack whatever belongings you have. I'll arrange your room at the boarding house and send a wagon for you at first light tomorrow." "That's acceptable." "One more thing." He pulled off his hat, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "This week won't be easy. The ranch hands will test you, the work will be harder than anything you've done, and the town will have plenty to say about my choice. If you're going to back out, better to do it now than waste both our time." Lydia felt a flash of the old anger, the familiar burn of being underestimated. "Mr. Rowland, I've spent 12 years being rejected, dismissed, and overlooked by men who thought I wasn't worth their time. I've worked jobs that would break most people, survived losses that would shatter most hearts, and kept moving forward when every sensible person told me to give up. Whatever tests your ranch hands devise, whatever hardships your land demands, whatever gossip this town invents, I've faced worse and survived." For the first time, Caleb Rowland smiled. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, almost approachable. "I believe you have. I'll see you tomorrow, Miss Hart." He turned to leave, but Lydia's voice stopped him. "Mr. Rowland? Why me? Truly?" He looked back, his expression serious again. "Because when I asked Margaret why she was here, she said she needed to marry. When I asked you, you told me you wanted a home and purpose and refused to be invisible anymore. I don't need a woman who needs to marry. I need one who wants to build something." He settled his hat back on his head. "Tomorrow, Miss Hart, first light." Then he was gone, climbing down from the platform and mounting his horse in one smooth motion. The crowd parted for him as he rode away, and within moments the thundering hoofbeats faded into the distance. Lydia stood frozen on the platform, her mind reeling. Around her, the crowd erupted into frantic whispers and speculation. Did that really just happen? Caleb Rowland chose her over the younger one? She must have bewitched him somehow. She's too old to give him heirs. What's he thinking? Did you hear how she talked to him? So forward, so bold. Mrs. Henderson appeared at Lydia's elbow, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Hart, oh my goodness, we should get you settled immediately. There's so much to arrange." But Lydia barely heard her. She was looking down at her hands, which were shaking. Not from fear exactly. From something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. After 7 rejections, after 12 years of failure and loss, after 3 days of standing invisible on this platform, someone had chosen her. Not despite her age or her honesty or her stubborn refusal to pretend weakness, but because of those things. It felt impossible. It felt like a dream she'd wake from any moment. But when Margaret touched her arm, her smile sad but genuine, Lydia knew it was real. "Congratulations," Margaret said softly. I hope it works out for you." "Thank you," Lydia managed. Then, because she knew what it felt like to be the one left behind, "Your turn will come, Margaret. Someone will see what you have to offer." Margaret's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, but she nodded. "Maybe. We'll see." As Mrs. Henderson hustled Lydia off the platform, already talking about arrangements and schedules and what she'd need to bring to the ranch, Lydia looked back one last time at the wooden structure where she'd spent 3 days being overlooked. She'd come to Dawson Creek expecting nothing. She'd stood on that platform prepared for one more rejection to add to her collection. Instead, she'd been chosen by the wealthiest man in 3 territories, a man who wanted a partner, not a decoration. A man who'd looked at her and seen strength instead of age, capability instead of plainness, possibility instead of rejection. It should have felt like victory, like vindication after years of failure. Instead, it felt terrifying, because now she had to prove she was everything she'd claimed to be. Now she had to face a week of tests designed to break her, all while knowing that one misstep could send her back to the platform, back to the rejection, back to the invisible existence she'd been trying so desperately to escape. Tomorrow. First light. 1 week to prove she could be the partner Caleb Rowland needed. Lydia straightened her spine and followed Mrs. Henderson toward the boarding house. She'd survived 12 years of rejection. She'd survived loss and loneliness and the slow erosion of every dream she'd once held dear. She could survive 1 week. She had to. Lydia didn't sleep that night. She lay in the narrow boarding house bed, staring at the ceiling, while her mind raced through everything that had happened and everything that would come. The room was small but clean, paid for by Caleb Rowland through the week's end, Mrs. Henderson had explained with barely concealed excitement. The other women in the house, permanent residents who worked as seamstresses and laundresses, had whispered and stared when Lydia arrived, their curiosity thick as smoke. When the first gray light crept through the thin curtains, Lydia was already dressed. She owned only 2 good dresses, both practical calico that had seen better days, and she'd chosen the sturdier of the 2. Her belongings fit into a single worn carpet bag, a spare dress, undergarments, a hairbrush, the small Bible her mother had given her before dying, and a daguerreotype of her parents taken before the war. Everything she owned in the world condensed to objects that wouldn't fill a wash basin. She was lacing her boots when she heard the wagon outside. Her hand stilled on the leather strings. This was real then. Not a dream or a mistake or some elaborate joke the town was playing on the spinster who'd stood too long in the sun. Caleb Rowland had sent for her, just as he'd promised. Lydia grabbed her bag and hurried downstairs before she could second-guess herself. The boarding house keeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Talbot, was already at the door, peering out at the wagon. "Well," Mrs. Talbot said without turning around, "I never thought I'd see the day Caleb Rowland sent his foreman to fetch a bride. You must have quite the tongue on you, Miss Hart, to convince that man of anything." "I didn't convince him of anything. I answered his questions honestly." Mrs. Talbot laughed, a dry sound like paper tearing. "Honey, every woman who's ever set her cap for Caleb Rowland has tried honesty, along with flattery, manipulation, tears, and outright seduction. None of it worked. So either you're lying about what you did, or he's finally lost his mind." Before Lydia could respond, the door swung open and a man stepped inside. He was older than Caleb, probably past 50, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He removed his hat when he saw them. "Miss Hart, I'm Tom Fletcher, foreman at the CR Ranch. Mr. Rowland sent me to bring you out." "I'm ready." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he'd expected more fuss or preparation. "Yes, ma'am. Wagon's just outside." Mrs. Talbot followed them onto the porch, her voice carrying across the quiet morning street. "You'll be back by supper, I expect, for propriety's sake." Tom glanced at Lydia before answering. "Mr. Rowland said Miss Hart would be spending the day at the ranch, learning what the work entails. I'll have her back before dark, ma'am. You have his word on that." The disapproval on Mrs. Talbot's face was clear, but she said nothing more. Lydia climbed into the wagon, settling her bag at her feet, and Tom clucked to the horses. As they pulled away from the boarding house, Lydia saw curtains twitching in windows up and down the street. The whole town was watching. "Don't mind the gossip," Tom said once they'd cleared Main Street. "Folks around here have been trying to marry off Caleb for 20 years. They're just surprised he finally made a choice, and more surprised it was you." "Because I'm too old?" "Because you're honest." Tom guided the horses onto a dirt road heading north out of town. Caleb's dealt with enough liars and schemers to last a lifetime. Woman shows up who says exactly what she means, that's worth more than youth or beauty, at least to a man like him. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. The land around Dawson Creek was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Rolling grassland dotted with scrub brush, the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. The morning sun painted everything gold, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass and something wild Lydia couldn't name. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. "About an hour by wagon. Longer on foot, but nobody walks it." Tom shot her a sideways glance. "You ever lived on a ranch before, Miss Hart?" "No, I grew up in a town. Small, but still a town." "Ranch life's different. Isolated. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles off, and the town's far enough that you don't just pop in for visits. You got to be comfortable with your own company, and you got to be comfortable with hard work. There's no servants out here, no easy life. Everybody works, even the boss." "Mr. Rowland warned me it would be difficult." "Difficult's one word for it." Tom was quiet for a moment, then continued carefully. "Ma'am, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but I've known Caleb Rowland for 15 years. Worked for him almost as long. He's a fair man, a good man, but he's not an easy man. He expects excellence from everyone around him, and he expects it from himself most of all. If you're thinking this week is going to be some kind of gentle courtship with flowers and pretty words, you're going to be disappointed. I'm not expecting flowers, Mr. Fletcher. I'm expecting exactly what he promised, a week to prove I can do the work." Tom nodded, seeming satisfied. "Good. That's good." He paused, then added, "The men are going to test you. Not out of meanness, but because they need to know you can handle yourself. Ranch this size, the boss's wife has real authority. They need to trust you'll use it right." "How will they test me?" "Can't say for certain, but they'll push, see where you break. Best advice I can give is don't try to prove you're strong by refusing help when you need it. Real strength is knowing your limits and working within them." Lydia filed that advice away as they crested a hill and the CR ranch came into view. It was bigger than she'd imagined, much bigger. The main house sat in a small valley, a sprawling 2-story structure built from local stone and timber. Behind it stretched barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings she couldn't identify. Cattle dotted the hillsides in every direction, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The whole operation hummed with activity, men on horseback moving between the buildings, wagons being loaded, the distant clang of a hammer on an anvil. "How many men work here?" Lydia asked, her voice faint. 32 counting me. More during roundup and branding season. Less in winter when some of the seasonal hands move on. Tom guided the wagon down the slope toward the main house. "There's the main house where Caleb lives, where you'd live if you marry him. The bunkhouses for the unmarried men. The foreman's cottage, that's mine. Cook shack for feeding the hands. Barns for the horses, cattle barns, equipment shed, smokehouse, springhouse, and about a dozen other buildings I'm probably forgetting." It was overwhelming. Lydia had known the ranch was large, but seeing it laid out before her, seeing the scope of what Caleb Rowland had built, made her chest tight with something between awe and terror. The wagon pulled up in front of the main house just as the door opened and Caleb stepped out. He was dressed for work in canvas pants and a faded shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. In the full light of morning, Lydia could see him more clearly than she had on the platform. He looked tired, she thought, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from years of carrying too much weight alone. "Miss Hart." He descended the porch steps as Tom helped her down from the wagon. "I trust you slept well?" It was a polite fiction, and they both knew it. "Well enough, thank you." "Good. We have a full day ahead." He nodded to Tom. "Thanks for fetching her." "You're needed at the south pasture. Jenkins found breaks in the fence line." "Yes, sir." Tom tipped his hat to Lydia. "Ma'am, good luck today." As the wagon pulled away, Lydia found herself alone with Caleb for the first time. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd remembered. Tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, broad-shouldered in a way that spoke of physical labor rather than leisure. But his eyes, those storm gray eyes, were steady and direct. "I'm going to be honest with you, Miss Hart. This week isn't going to be pleasant." "So I've been told, multiple times." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Good. Then you won't be surprised when it gets hard." He gestured toward the house. "Come inside. We'll start with the house itself, then move to the other operations." The interior of the house was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's dwelling. The main room was large and airy, with sturdy furniture and clean floors. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on three sides let in generous light. But it was clearly a man's space. No curtains, no decorative touches, nothing soft or welcoming about it. 32 men eat breakfast at 5:30 every morning, Caleb said without preamble. They work until noon, then break for the main meal. Supper's at 6. The cook handles the bunkhouse meals, but the main house is different. I eat here, and I host business dinners at least twice a month. Buyers, other ranchers, occasionally the banker from town. The boss's wife would be expected to plan those meals, oversee the preparation, and serve as hostess. He walked her through the house as he spoke, pointing out the kitchen, the dining room, the upstairs bedrooms. The house needs cleaning weekly, laundry every Monday, marketing done in town every other Friday. You'd manage the household budget, purchase supplies, and keep records of expenditures. Can you do that? Yes. Lydia studied the kitchen, a large workspace with a modern cast iron stove, good knives, and adequate storage. Who does it now? I do, along with everything else. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her examine the space. I won't lie to you, Miss Hart. I need help. The ranch has grown beyond what one person can manage alone, but I've been too stubborn to admit it until now. Why now? Why decide you need a wife after all this time? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Because I'm 42 years old, and I'm starting to see the end of what I can build alone. I want sons to pass this ranch to, but more than that, I want a partner who can help me make it better. Someone who sees what I've built and wants to build more. Someone who understands that a ranch this size is never finished. It's always growing or dying, and standing still isn't an option. It was the most words she'd heard him string together, and the honesty in them struck her like a physical blow. This wasn't a man looking for convenience or decoration. This was a man looking for a fellow architect to help construct something that would outlast them both. What if I can't do it? The question escaped before Lydia could stop it. What if I try my best and it's still not enough? Caleb's expression softened slightly. Then we'll know by the end of the week, and you'll leave with my thanks and enough money to start over somewhere else. But I don't think that's what will happen. Why not? Because you stood on that platform for 3 days, getting rejected over and over, and you didn't quit. That kind of stubbornness is exactly what this ranch needs. Before Lydia could respond, the door banged open and a man strode in without knocking. He was younger than Caleb, maybe 35, with sandy hair and a cocky grin that faltered when he saw Lydia. Boss, we got a problem with the... He stopped mid-sentence. Oh, sorry. Didn't know you had company. Miss Hart, this is Ray Cooper, my lead wrangler. Ray, this is Lydia Hart. She's here for the week. Ray's eyes widened with recognition. You're the one from the platform? The one he caught himself, his grin returning full force. Well, I'll be damned. Pleasure to meet you, ma'am. Mr. Cooper? Lydia kept her voice neutral, but she caught the way Ray was looking at her, assessing, slightly mocking, clearly skeptical. What's the problem? Caleb asked. Buck's been teaching the new horses some bad habits, knocked down 2 handlers this morning and tried to kick Jenkins when he got too close. You want me to work with him, or should we just cut our losses and sell him off? I'll handle Buck myself. Caleb turned to Lydia. I need to deal with this. You'll come with me. Might as well see the whole operation, good and bad. They walked across the yard toward the corrals, Ray trailing behind with barely concealed amusement. Lydia could feel him watching her, waiting for her to stumble or complain or show weakness. She kept her spine straight and her steps steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction. The horse corral held about a dozen animals, but Lydia's attention went immediately to the big bay in the center. He was magnificent, easily 16 hands with a deep chest and powerful hindquarters. He was also clearly furious, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring, circling the corral like a caged storm. That's Buck, Caleb said unnecessarily. Bought him off a rancher down south who couldn't handle him. He's got the bloodlines to improve our stock, but he's mean as a snake and twice as unpredictable. Why keep him if he's dangerous? Because dangerous and worthless aren't the same thing. He just needs someone who won't back down. Caleb climbed over the corral fence without hesitation. Stay there. Don't move, and don't make sudden noises. Lydia gripped the fence rail as Caleb approached Buck slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. The horse watched him come, tension vibrating through every muscle. When Caleb got within 10 feet, Buck charged. Lydia's heart stopped. But Caleb didn't run or flinch. He stood his ground, and at the last second, Buck veered away, circling wide and coming back for another charge. Again, Caleb held his position. Again, Buck veered off. "He's testing," Ray said from beside her, his voice carrying easy confidence. "Seeing if the boss will break. He won't." The dance continued for 20 minutes, Buck charging, Caleb standing firm, the horse's challenges growing less aggressive with each pass. Finally, Buck stopped in the center of the corral, sides heaving, and allowed Caleb to approach. Caleb's hand touched the horse's neck, and Buck's ears flicked forward. "There," Caleb murmured, his voice too low for Lydia to hear the words. "We understand each other now." When he climbed back over the fence, Ray was grinning. "Damn show-off. You just had to prove you could handle him in front of the lady." "I proved he can be handled at all, which is what you were doubting." Caleb's tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. "Get one of the gentler hands to work with him this afternoon. Slow and steady, no force. He'll come around." "Yes, sir." Ray tipped his hat to Lydia. "Welcome to the CR, ma'am. Hope you got a strong stomach, because it gets rougher than that around here." After he left, Caleb studied Lydia's face. "You look pale. Do you need to sit down?" "No?" Lydia's voice came out steadier than she felt. "But I think I understand why you asked if I could shoot a rifle. If that's how you handle horses, I can only imagine what happens when there's real trouble." "There's always real trouble on a ranch this size. Predators, rustlers, weather that can kill a whole herd if you're not prepared. Last winter we lost 50 head to a blizzard that came up so fast we couldn't get them to shelter." He started walking again, and Lydia fell into step beside him. "The question isn't whether trouble will come. It's whether you can face it without falling apart." They spent the next 3 hours touring the ranch operations. Caleb showed her the cattle barns where newborn calves were kept separate from the herd, the equipment sheds full of tools and machinery she didn't recognize, the spring house where dairy products were kept cool, the smokehouse where meat was cured. He introduced her to a steady stream of ranch hands, some polite, some curious, some openly doubtful that this plain, older woman was really the boss's choice. By the time they reached the cook shack, Lydia's feet ached and her head spun with information. The cook, a grizzled man named Pete, who looked old enough to have fought in the Revolution, barely glanced up when they entered. "Boss, you eating here or the house?" "The house. But Miss Hart will be helping you with lunch service today." That got Pete's attention. He looked Lydia up and down with rheumy eyes. "That right? You know how to cook for 30 men, girl?" "I've cooked for work crews before. Construction camps, mostly." "Construction camps." Pete snorted. "Men'll eat anything when they're working construction. Ranch hands are different. They're picky. They complain. And if the food's bad, they'll let you know real loud." He jerked his thumb toward the massive stove. "You ever use a commercial range?" "No, but I can learn." "Learn fast, then. Lunch is in 2 hours, and I'm making beef stew, biscuits, and apple pie for 32 men. You're on biscuits." Caleb started to protest, but Lydia cut him off. "That's fine. Where's your flour?" Pete pointed to a massive barrel in the corner. "Help yourself. Mix is 1 part lard to 3 parts flour, pinch of salt, buttermilk to bind. Don't overwork the dough, or they'll come out tough." Lydia rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She was aware of Caleb watching from the doorway, aware of Pete's suspicious glances as he stirred his enormous pot of stew, aware that this was another test. The cook shack was hot as blazes, with the stove going full blast, and sweat soon plastered her dress to her back. Her arms ached from cutting the lard into the flour, and the buttermilk was just slightly sour, requiring careful measurement to avoid ruining the batch. But she'd made biscuits 1,000 times, in her father's kitchen, in boarding house kitchens, in work camp kitchens where she'd traded cooking for meals. Her hands knew the work even if her mind was still reeling from everything she'd seen that morning. When the first pan of biscuits came out of the oven, golden brown and perfectly risen, Pete grunted something that might have been approval. "Not bad. Make 4 more pans just like that and you might be worth keeping around." By the time the lunch bell rang, Lydia had produced 6 pans of biscuits, helped Pete dish up 32 bowls of stew, and set out the apple pies Pete had made that morning. The ranch hands filed in, dusty and hungry, their conversations dying when they saw Lydia standing beside Pete. "Listen up," Pete barked. "This is Miss Hart. She made the biscuits, and if I hear any complaining about them, you'll answer to me." The men took their seats, and for a few minutes the only sound was eating. Lydia stood near the stove, her heart pounding, waiting for judgment. Finally, one of the younger hands spoke up. "These biscuits are really good, ma'am. Light as air." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Ray Cooper, sitting at the far end, raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Not bad for a first try, Miss Hart. But can you do it every day for a month without the quality dropping?" "I suppose we'll find out if I'm here for a month, Mr. Cooper." That got a few chuckles from the men. Ray grinned, apparently enjoying the sparring. "Fair enough. What do you think of the ranch so far?" "I think it's bigger than I expected and better organized than most operations half its size." Diplomatic answer. Ray leaned back in his chair. "But what do you really think? You think you can handle being the boss's wife, living out here miles from town, managing this place?" The room went quiet. Every eye turned to Lydia, waiting for her answer. This was the real test, she realized, not the biscuits or the tour or anything else. This was 32 men trying to figure out if she was strong enough to be part of their world. Lydia met Ray's gaze steadily. "I think it's too early to know for certain. But I also think if I was the kind of woman who scared easily, I wouldn't have stood on that platform for 3 days waiting to be chosen. So we'll see, Mr. Cooper, we'll see." Ray's grin widened. "I like her, boss. She's got spine." "I noticed," Caleb spoke from the doorway, where he'd been watching the whole exchange. "All right, men. Lunch break's over in 10 minutes. Ray, take your crew to the north pasture and check those fences. Jenkins, you're on water duty. Pete, save some of that stew for supper. I'll be taking Miss Hart back to town soon." The men filed out, several of them nodding respectfully to Lydia as they passed. When the cook shack was empty except for her, Caleb, and Pete, the old cook fixed Lydia with a penetrating stare. "You did good today, girl. Real good. But don't think one meal means you've won anybody over. These men are loyal to the boss, and they'll only accept you if they believe you're good for him and good for the ranch. Keep that in mind." "I will. Thank you, Pete." After helping clean up the lunch dishes, Lydia followed Caleb back to the main house. The afternoon sun was brutal, and her dress was soaked with sweat and spotted with flour. She felt exhausted, overwhelmed, and strangely exhilarated. "You handled yourself well today," Caleb said as they reached the porch. "Better than I expected, honestly." "You expected me to fail?" "I expected you to struggle more. The heat, the work, the men testing you. Most women would have asked to leave by now." He leaned against the porch railing. "But you didn't. Why?" Lydia thought about it carefully. "Because this is the first time in 12 years that someone has looked at me and seen possibility instead of failure. I'm not going to waste that by giving up at the first sign of difficulty." Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "The men like you. That's important. Pete especially doesn't warm to people easily, and he was impressed." The biscuits helped. "It wasn't just the biscuits." Caleb pushed off from the railing. "Tomorrow will be harder. I'll have Tom pick you up at dawn, and you'll spend the full day here, cooking all 3 meals, managing the household tasks, meeting with the ranch accountant to review the books. If you can handle that, we'll move to the next test." "What's the next test?" "Riding the property line with me. 10 hours in the saddle, rough terrain, no breaks except what the horses need. I need to know you can handle the physical demands when I need you beside me." Lydia's legs already ached from the walking she'd done today, and her hands were sore from mixing biscuit dough. 10 hours on horseback sounded like torture. But she nodded. "I'll be ready." "I believe you will." He studied her for a long moment. "One more thing, Miss Hart. If at any point this week you decide it's too much, if you want to leave, just tell me." "I won't think less of you, and I'll keep my promise about paying your way somewhere else. This only works if we're both choosing it freely." "I understand." "Do you?" His voice was gentle but serious. "Because once we marry, there's no going back. This ranch becomes your life. These problems become your problems, and this isolation becomes your reality. I need you to be certain. Lydia looked out at the sprawling ranch, at the distant cattle dotting the hillsides, at the men working in the corrals and the smoke rising from the bunkhouses. It was harsh and beautiful and utterly foreign to everything she'd known before. But it was also real. A real home, a real purpose, a real chance to build something that mattered. I'm not certain yet, she said honestly, but I want to be. That's why I'm here. Caleb nodded slowly. That's fair. Come on, I'll take you back to town before Mrs. Talbot sends out a search party. The ride back to Dawson Creek was quieter than the morning journey. Caleb handled the wagon himself, his hands steady on the reins, his attention on the road. Lydia sat beside him, watching the landscape roll past, her mind churning through everything she'd seen and learned. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Go ahead. Why didn't you ever marry before? Surely in 20 years of building this ranch, there were women interested. Caleb was silent for so long, Lydia thought he wouldn't answer. Then, his voice low, he spoke. There were women interested in the ranch, in the money, the status, the comfort. None of them were interested in the work. They wanted to be the boss's wife without understanding what that meant. The early mornings and late nights, the failed harvests and harsh winters, the constant struggle to keep everything running. They wanted the reward without the risk. And you think I'm different? I think you've already lived through enough hardship to understand that nothing worth having comes easy. I think you're willing to work for what you want instead of expecting it to be handed to you. He glanced at her. Am I wrong? No, you're not wrong. They reached town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of the boarding house where Mrs. Talbot was indeed waiting on the porch, her expression hovering between concern and nosiness. Thank you for today, Lydia said as Caleb helped her down. It was enlightening. Tomorrow will be longer. Get some rest. He tipped his hat to Mrs. Talbot. Ma'am, I'll have her back by sunset tomorrow. After he drove away, Mrs. Talbot descended on Lydia like a hawk on a mouse. Well, how was it? What's the ranch like? Did he behave as a gentleman should? Did the men treat you properly? Lydia was too tired for interrogation. It was fine, Mrs. Talbot. The ranch is large, the work is hard, and everyone was perfectly civil. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to lie down. But there was no peace in the boarding house. The other women had heard about Lydia's day at the CR ranch, and they clustered around her room like bees around honey, full of questions and speculation and thinly veiled judgment. Is it true he has 30 men working for him? I heard the house is practically a mansion. Did he propose properly, or is this whole thing just some kind of arrangement? How can you possibly manage a household that size when you've never even been married? Lydia answered what she could and deflected the rest, but by the time she finally closed her door and collapsed onto the bed, her head was pounding. She thought about the week ahead. More tests, more scrutiny, more opportunities to prove herself or fail spectacularly in front of everyone watching. She thought about Caleb's offer to leave at any time, no judgment, no consequences. It would be so easy to give up now, before she got in too deep, before she started hoping this might actually work. But then she remembered standing on that platform, invisible and unwanted, watching other women get chosen while she stood alone. She remembered 12 years of rejection, 12 years of being told she wasn't good enough, wasn't young enough, wasn't anything enough. And she remembered Caleb walking past everyone else and choosing her. Not despite her age or her plainness or her honesty, but because of those things. Tomorrow would be harder. The day after would be harder still. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lydia felt like she was building towards something instead of running from something. She fell asleep with her muscles aching and her hands sore and her heart cautiously, dangerously hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this impossible week might actually lead somewhere worth going. Tom arrived even earlier the next morning, the sky still more black than gray when his knock rattled Lydia's door. She'd been awake for an hour already, unable to sleep past 4 with anticipation coiling tight in her stomach. Her muscles screamed in protest as she dressed. Every part of her body ached from yesterday's work, stiff and sore, in ways that made even buttoning her dress feel like labor. Mrs. Talbot was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with coffee and hard biscuits. her expression pinched with disapproval. It's unseemly, Miss Hart. Riding out to a man's ranch before dawn, spending entire days there without proper supervision. People are talking. Let them talk. Lydia took the coffee gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. I have 6 more days to prove myself, Mrs. Talbot. I can't afford to worry about gossip. 6 more days? Mrs. Talbot's voice dropped to something almost pitying. And then what? You think Caleb Rowland is actually going to marry you? A man who's turned down every eligible woman in 3 territories for 20 years? The doubt wormed its way under Lydia's skin, finding purchase in her own fears. What if this whole week was some kind of elaborate test she was destined to fail? What if Caleb was just proving to himself, and to the town, that no woman could handle the CR ranch? But she thought about the way he'd looked at her yesterday when she'd faced down Ray Cooper's challenge. The respect in his eyes when she'd admitted she wasn't certain yet, but wanted to be. That hadn't been the look of a man playing games. I guess we'll find out, Lydia said, setting down the empty cup. Thank you for the coffee. The ride to the ranch was silent except for the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of hooves on packed dirt. Tom seemed to sense her exhaustion and didn't push for conversation. When they finally crested the hill and the ranch came into view, lights were already burning in the cook shack and several of the outbuildings. The whole operation woke early, Lydia was learning. There was no sleeping late when you had thousands of cattle and hundreds of acres to manage. Caleb was waiting on the porch, 2 steaming cups in his hands. He descended the steps as Tom helped Lydia down, offering her one of the cups without preamble. Coffee. Black? Pete says you take it that way. Lydia accepted it, surprised by the gesture. Thank you. You look tired. Didn't sleep? Not much. She sipped the coffee, strong enough to strip paint, but welcome nonetheless. Nervous, I suppose. Don't be. Today's just more of the same. Breakfast at 5:30, managing the household until noon, lunch service, then we'll review the ranch accounts together. He studied her face in the growing light. You sure you're up for this? I can have Tom take you back if you need rest. It was tempting. Every muscle in her body was screaming for mercy, and the thought of cooking for 32 men again made her want to weep. But she shook her head. I'm fine. Where do you need me? A flash of approval crossed his face. Kitchen. Pete's already started breakfast, but he'll need help. I'll join you for the meal, then head out to check the south fence line. You'll be on your own most of the day. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of heat and motion. Pete had her frying eggs and bacon in massive batches, slicing bread, pouring coffee for the endless stream of men who filed through. Her hands grew slick with grease, her face flushed from the stove's heat, and her feet throbbed in her boots. But she kept moving, kept working, because stopping meant admitting defeat. The ranch hands were friendlier this morning, offering ma'ams and thank yous as she served them. A few even attempted small talk, asking where she was from and how she liked the ranch so far. Lydia answered politely but briefly, too focused on keeping up with Pete's demands to engage in real conversation. Caleb ate quickly and efficiently, barely seeming to taste the food as he discussed the day's work schedule with Tom and Ray. When he finished, he caught Lydia's eye across the crowded room. I'll be back by 4. If you need anything, Pete knows where to find me. Then he was gone, and Lydia was left to face the mountain of dishes from breakfast, the list of household tasks Caleb had left on the kitchen table, and Pete's announcement that she'd be making lunch entirely on her own while he dealt with a butchering job. You said you could cook for 30 men, Pete reminded her, his tone challenging. Time to prove it. By noon, Lydia had produced a passable beef and potato stew, 2 dozen cornbread muffins, and a cobbler made from canned peaches she'd found in the spring house. Her hands were blistered from the hot pans. Her dress was stained beyond saving, and she'd burned herself twice on the massive stove. But when the men filed in for lunch, the food was ready and still hot. Ray was the first to taste the stew, his expression thoughtful as he chewed. The entire room seemed to hold its breath waiting for his verdict. It's good, he said finally. Not as good as Pete's, but good enough that I'd eat it again. The tension broke. Men dug into their meals, and the usual lunch conversation resumed. Lydia sagged against the counter, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. But there was no time to rest. Dishes needed washing, the main house needed cleaning, and Caleb had left a note asking her to inventory the household supplies and prepare a list of what needed ordering from town. Lydia worked through the afternoon in a haze of fatigue, her body moving on autopilot while her mind drifted between determination and despair. She was sweeping the main house porch when the sound of multiple horses approaching made her look up. Caleb rode at the front of a group of 6 men, all of them dusty and tired-looking. As they dismounted, Lydia noticed blood on Caleb's sleeve. She dropped the broom and hurried down the steps. "You're hurt." Caleb glanced at his arm as if just noticing the wound. "Caught it on barbed wire. It's nothing." "It's bleeding through your shirt. That's not nothing." Lydia's voice came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with fear she didn't want to examine too closely. "Inside! Now!" Ray, standing nearby, let out a low whistle. "Boss, I think she just gave you an order." "I noticed." But Caleb didn't argue, following Lydia into the house while his men watched with varying degrees of amusement. In the kitchen, Lydia pushed him into a chair and began unbuttoning his sleeve. "Where's your medical supplies?" "Cabinet above the sink. But really, Miss Hart, this isn't—" "Hold still." She found the supplies and wet a clean cloth, then carefully peeled back the blood-soaked fabric. The gash was deep, running from his elbow to his wrist, the edges ragged from the wire. "This needs stitches." "I've had worse." "That doesn't mean you should ignore it." Lydia cleaned the wound as gently as she could, trying not to flinch when Caleb hissed in pain. "Do you have a doctor you trust, or do you usually just let wounds fester until you lose the arm?" Despite the pain, Caleb's lips twitched. "There's a doctor in town, but he's 3 hours round trip. I've stitched myself up before." "Have you stitched your own arm before? Because I don't see how that's physically possible." Lydia examined the supplies in the cabinet and found a needle and thread. "I can do it if you'll let me." "You know how to stitch wounds?" "My father was a shopkeeper in a rough town. I stitched him up more times than I can count after he broke up fights or dealt with difficult customers." She threaded the needle with steady hands, though her heart was racing. "This will hurt." "I assumed as much." Lydia worked quickly and carefully, her fingers remembering the motions even though it had been years since she'd done this. Caleb sat perfectly still, his jaw clenched, watching her face rather than the needle piercing his skin. When she finished and tied off the thread, she wrapped the wound in clean bandages. "There. Try to keep it dry and clean. Change the bandage tomorrow and watch for infection." "Yes, ma'am." Caleb flexed his arm experimentally, then caught her hand before she could step away. "Thank you. That was well done." His hand was warm and rough with calluses, completely engulfing hers. Lydia felt something shift in her chest, an awareness that had nothing to do with medicine or ranch work and everything to do with the man sitting before her. She pulled her hand back, suddenly flustered. "I should finish cleaning. You wanted to review the accounts before supper." If Caleb noticed her discomfort, he didn't comment on it. He rolled down his sleeve carefully over the bandage. "The office is upstairs. Give me a few minutes to wash up, then we'll go through the books." The ranch office was a surprisingly organized space, shelves lined with ledgers, maps of the property tacked to the walls, a large desk covered in neat stacks of paperwork. Caleb settled into the chair behind the desk and gestured for Lydia to take the seat across from him. "The CR Ranch runs on credit and cash in roughly equal measure," he began, opening the current ledger. "We sell cattle twice a year, spring and fall. The money from those sales has to carry us through until the next sale, covering wages, supplies, equipment repairs, and unexpected expenses. We also trade with local merchants for goods we can't produce ourselves." For the next 2 hours, Caleb walked Lydia through the ranch finances with patient thoroughness. He showed her how he tracked expenses, managed payroll, negotiated contracts with buyers, and maintained reserves for emergencies. The numbers were staggering, thousands of dollars moving through the ranch every month, complex transactions that required careful management. "The boss's wife traditionally handles the household accounts," Caleb explained. "Food, supplies, clothing for the hands, medical expenses, anything related to daily operations. I handle the cattle sales and major expenditures, but you'd need to understand the whole picture to make good decisions." Lydia studied the ledgers, her mind working through the implications. "This is more complex than I expected. You're essentially running a small town here. That's exactly what it is. 32 men depending on this ranch for their livelihoods, their homes, their futures. Every decision I make affects all of them. He leaned back in his chair. That's why I need a partner who understands what's at stake. Someone who can look at these numbers and see the lives behind them. What happens if you have a bad year? If the cattle prices drop or you lose too many head to weather or disease? We tighten our belts, cut expenses where we can, defer equipment purchases, sometimes let a few hands go temporarily. His expression was grim. I've had to make those decisions before. They're never easy. But you've never lost the ranch. No, I built this place from nothing, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep it running. He studied her face. Does that scare you? Knowing that security here is never guaranteed? Lydia thought about her father's store, lost to debt after his death, about the boarding houses where she'd lived one step ahead of eviction, about the constant uncertainty that had defined her adult life. Nothing is ever guaranteed, Mr. Rowland. At least here you're fighting for something that matters. Something in his expression softened. Call me Caleb. If we're going to be partners, we should probably be on first-name terms. Caleb, then. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. And I'm Lydia. I know. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Tom's probably waiting with the wagon to take you back to town. Tomorrow's the property ride. 10 hours in the saddle. Can you handle that? Every part of Lydia's body was already screaming in protest at the thought. I'll manage. Wear your sturdiest clothes and bring a canteen. We'll be riding rough country, and there won't be any shelter if the weather turns. He stood, moving around the desk to help her up. You did well today, Lydia. Better than well, actually. The men are starting to see you as part of this place. And you? What do you see? The question escaped before she could stop it. Too revealing, too vulnerable. But Caleb didn't look away or deflect. He considered her seriously, his gray eyes steady. I see someone strong enough to do what needs doing without complaint. Someone smart enough to learn quickly and honest enough to admit what she doesn't know. Someone who stitched up my arm without being asked and didn't flinch from the blood. He paused. I see possibility, Lydia. Real possibility for what we could build together. The words settled into Lydia's chest, warm and terrifying. This was becoming real. The abstract idea of marrying Caleb Rowland was transforming into the concrete reality of partnership with this complicated, driven man who looked at her and saw strength instead of failure. I should go, she said quietly, before Mrs. Talbot has me arrested for indecency. The ride back to town felt different than the previous evening. Tom seemed more relaxed, offering observations about the ranch and asking Lydia's opinions on small matters. Word had clearly spread that she'd handled lunch on her own and stitched up the boss's arm without being told. The ranch hands were starting to accept her presence. But Dawson Creek was less forgiving. As Tom's wagon rolled down Main Street, Lydia saw the stares and whispers following them. Women gathered in small clusters, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Men loitered outside the saloon, watching with calculating eyes. Mrs. Talbot was waiting with 2 other boarding house residents, her face tight with barely suppressed excitement. The moment Lydia stepped through the door, they descended. Is it true you spent the entire day alone with him? People are saying you were in his bedroom. The butcher's wife saw you through the window, stitching something. How can you possibly think this is appropriate behavior for an unmarried woman? Lydia held up a hand, cutting through the barrage of questions. I spent the day working. Cooking, cleaning, learning the ranch operations, and yes, treating a wound Mr. Rowland sustained while working. Everything was entirely proper, and if people want to imagine otherwise, that's their problem, not mine. But don't you care what they're saying? Mrs. Talbot looked genuinely distressed. Your reputation? My reputation was ruined the moment I stood on that platform for 3 days and got rejected 7 times, Lydia said flatly. At least now I'm being talked about for doing something productive instead of being pitied for my failures. She pushed past them and climbed the stairs to her room, ignoring the continued whispers behind her. Inside, she collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed, too exhausted to even remove her boots. Her hands were blistered, her muscles screamed, and her head throbbed with fatigue. But underneath the exhaustion was something else. Pride, maybe. Or satisfaction at having survived another impossible day. She'd cooked for 32 men, managed household tasks she'd never attempted before, reviewed complex financial records, and stitched a wound that would have sent most women running for the doctor. And Caleb had looked at her and seen possibility. Sleep claimed her quickly, but it was fitful, full of dreams about endless prairies and gray eyes and the weight of responsibility settling onto shoulders that weren't sure they were strong enough to carry it. Dawn came too soon. Lydia forced herself upright despite every instinct screaming to stay horizontal, dressed in her sturdiest skirt and most practical blouse, and met Tom at the door with a determination born of pure stubbornness. "Big day," Tom said as they headed out of town. "Property ride's the real test. Some of the terrain's rough, and 10 hours is a long time to stay mounted if you're not used to it. I've ridden before. Ranch riding's different than pleasure riding, ma'am. Just pace yourself. Don't try to keep up with Caleb if it means pushing yourself to injury. He'll respect you more for knowing your limits than for pretending you don't have any." When they arrived at the ranch, Caleb was in the corral saddling 2 horses, a massive roan gelding for himself and a smaller but sturdy-looking mare. He looked up when Lydia approached, assessing her outfit with a critical eye. "You'll need a hat. Sun's brutal out there." He disappeared into the barn and returned with a worn hat that had clearly seen better days. "It's not pretty, but it works." Lydia settled the hat on her head, tucking her hair back as best she could. "Where are we riding?" "The full property line, north boundary first, then west, then south. We'll stop to check fences, look for breaks, mark anything that needs repair." He helped her mount the mare with steady, impersonal hands. "Her name's Daisy. She's steady and won't spook easily. Trust her, and she'll take care of you." The ride started gently enough, following well-worn trails through grassland that rolled like a green ocean. Caleb rode slightly ahead, pointing out landmarks and explaining the boundaries of his property. But as the morning wore on and they moved into rougher terrain, the ride became more challenging. They crossed rocky hillsides where Daisy had to pick her way carefully between boulders. They forded shallow streams where the water ran fast enough to make Lydia's heart race. They climbed steep inclines that left both horses breathing hard, and Lydia clinging to the saddle horn for balance. By mid-morning, every muscle in Lydia's body was on fire. Her thighs screamed from gripping the saddle, her back ached from the constant motion, and her hands were cramping from holding the reins. But Caleb never slowed, never looked back to check if she was keeping up. He rode with the assumption that she would, and somehow that expectation kept her moving. They stopped once at a windmill where Caleb checked the water pump and made notes about needed repairs. Lydia dismounted gratefully, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. She drank from her canteen and tried to stretch without being obvious about how much pain she was in. "How are you holding up?" Caleb asked, not looking at her as he examined the windmill mechanism. "Fine. That's a lie, but I appreciate the effort." He finished his inspection and turned to face her. "We're about halfway through. If you need to rest longer, we can." "I'm fine," Lydia repeated, more firmly this time. "Let's keep moving." They remounted and continued. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the terrain grew even rougher. Lydia's vision started to blur at the edges from exhaustion and pain, but she focused on Caleb's back, on Daisy's steady rhythm, on simply staying in the saddle one moment at a time. They were crossing a narrow ravine when Daisy stumbled on loose rock. Lydia pitched forward, losing her balance, and for one terrifying moment she was certain she'd fall. But her hands gripped the reins by pure instinct, and she managed to pull herself back into the saddle as Daisy recovered her footing. Caleb was beside her in an instant, his hand on Daisy's bridle. "Are you hurt?" "No." Lydia's voice shook despite her best efforts. "Just startled." He studied her face, then the ravine they'd been crossing. "We can turn back. We've seen enough for today." "We haven't finished the property line." "Lydia, you said 10 hours. We finished the 10 hours." She straightened in the saddle, meeting his gaze. "I'm not quitting because of one stumble." Something fierce and approving flashed in his eyes. "All right, but you tell me if it becomes too much." They finished the ride as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. By the time they returned to the main ranch, Lydia was barely conscious, clinging to the saddle through sheer force of will. When Caleb lifted her down from Daisy, her legs gave out completely. He caught her before she hit the ground, steadying her with hands that were surprisingly gentle for their size. Easy. Just breathe. Lydia stood there, supported by his strength, and felt tears of exhaustion and pain burning behind her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. She'd done it. 10 hours in the saddle across some of the roughest terrain she'd ever seen. She'd done it. I think, Caleb said quietly, still holding her upright, you might be the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Is that a compliment or a criticism? With you? It's both. He guided her to the porch steps and made her sit. Stay here. I'll get some water and something for the pain. While he was gone, Ray appeared from the direction of the barns. He took one look at Lydia's exhausted, dust-covered form and grinned. Heard you rode the full property line today. That true? Yes. In one day? Without stopping? We stopped once to check a windmill. Ray let out a low whistle. I'll be damned. Most ranch hands can't manage that ride their first time out. Hell, I know men who've worked here for years who complain about it. He studied her with new respect. You're tougher than you look, Miss Hart. Thank you, Mr. Cooper. Ray, anyone who can match the boss stride for stride has earned first names. He tipped his hat. Welcome to the CR, Lydia. I think you're going to fit in just fine. When Caleb returned with water and willow bark tea for the pain, he found Lydia smiling despite her exhaustion. He raised an eyebrow in question. Ray called me by my first name, she explained. Said I'd earned it. High praise from Ray. He doesn't warm to people easily. Caleb sat beside her on the steps, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. You surprised him today. Surprised all of us, actually. Even me, and I don't surprise easily. Because I didn't quit? Because you could have quit at a dozen different points, and nobody would have blamed you. But you didn't. You kept going even when it clearly hurt, even when you had nothing left to prove. He handed her the tea. That kind of determination is exactly what this ranch needs. Lydia sipped the bitter tea, feeling its warmth spread through her exhausted body. How many more tests are there? No more tests. Caleb's voice was quiet, but certain. You've proven everything you need to prove. The question now is whether you want this life. Whether you can look at what you've seen this week and decide it's worth choosing. You're ready to make that decision after only 3 days? I made that decision on the platform when you told me you refused to be invisible anymore. These 3 days just confirmed what I already suspected, that you're capable of being the partner I need. He turned to face her fully. But I won't rush you. You have 4 more days to be certain. Take them. Use them to decide if this life is what you want, or if you'd rather use my money to start over somewhere else. Lydia looked out at the ranch she'd spent 3 exhausting days learning to navigate. The sprawling buildings, the distant cattle, the men moving through their evening routines with practiced efficiency. It was harsh and beautiful and overwhelming and real. And standing in the middle of it was Caleb Rowland, offering her not romance or rescue, but partnership, offering her a home, a purpose, and the terrifying responsibility of helping build something that would outlast them both. I don't need 4 more days, she said quietly. I already know my answer. Caleb went very still. And what is it? Lydia turned to meet his storm-gray eyes, seeing in them the same possibility she felt building in her chest. Ask me properly, and I'll tell you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb stood and held out his hand. When Lydia took it, he pulled her to her feet and led her down the porch steps into the yard. The setting sun painted everything gold, and the evening breeze carried the smell of grass and cattle and the wild open spaces that surrounded them. Caleb went down on one knee in the dust, still holding her hand, and Lydia's heart stuttered in her chest. Lydia Hart, he said, his voice steady and sure. I'm not offering you an easy life or a romantic one. I'm offering you hard work and long days and a partnership that will test you every moment. But I'm also offering you a home, a purpose, and the chance to build something that matters. Will you marry me? Lydia looked down at this complicated, driven man who'd walked past everyone else and chosen her, who'd seen strength where others saw age, capability where others saw plainness, possibility where others saw failure. Yes, she said, and felt the word change everything. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb stood, still holding her hand, and for a moment they simply looked at each other in the golden evening light. Then he nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and called out toward the bunkhouses. "Tom! Ray! Get the men together!" Within minutes, ranch hands were emerging from buildings across the property, drawn by the unusual summons. They gathered in a loose semicircle around the porch, dusty and curious, their conversations dying as Caleb raised his hand for silence. "Miss Hart has agreed to become my wife," he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "We'll marry tomorrow morning in town. I expect every man who can be spared from essential duties to attend." He paused, his hand still wrapped around Lydia's. "This woman will be your boss's wife and mistress of this ranch. You'll treat her with the same respect you show me, and you'll follow her orders as you would mine. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, sir," rippled through the assembled men. Then Ray stepped forward, a genuine smile splitting his weathered face. "Congratulations, boss." "Ma'am." He looked at Lydia with something that might have been admiration. "I'll admit, I had my doubts at first, but anyone who can ride the property line without complaint and stitch up the boss without flinching has earned her place here." One by one, the other men came forward to offer congratulations. Some were warmly genuine, others more reserved, but all of them seemed to accept the reality of what was happening. Lydia shook hands until her arm ached, accepting their well wishes with a grace she didn't entirely feel. Because underneath the congratulations and the smiles, fear was beginning to creep in. She'd just agreed to marry a man she'd known for 3 days. Tomorrow morning she would become Lydia Rowland, mistress of a ranch larger than some towns, responsible for managing a household and operation she barely understood. The magnitude of what she'd committed to was starting to crush the breath from her lungs. Pete was the last to approach, his rheumy eyes sharp as they studied her face. "You look like you're about to bolt, girl." "I'm fine." "That's twice now you've lied about being fine." Crossed his arms. "Listen to me. Marriage is hard. Marriage to a man like Caleb, with responsibilities like these, is harder still. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fail at things. You're going to have days where you wonder why you ever agreed to this." He paused. "But if you're smart enough to ask for help when you need it and stubborn enough to keep trying when things get rough, you'll be all right." "And if I'm not? Smart enough or stubborn enough?" Pete's weathered face creased into something almost kind. "Then you wouldn't have made it through the last 3 days. Now get yourself back to town and get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." The ride back to Dawson Creek was quiet. Tom seemed to sense that Lydia needed silence to process what had just happened, and he kept his attention on the road while she stared unseeing at the darkening landscape. Her mind was spinning with everything that would need to happen before tomorrow, informing Mrs. Talbot, deciding what to wear, packing her meager belongings, preparing herself to stand before the town that had watched her get rejected 7 times and claim the wealthiest man in 3 territories as her husband. Mrs. Talbot was waiting on the porch again, but this time her expression was different, sharper, more calculating. She knew. Somehow, she already knew. "Is it true?" she demanded before Lydia had even reached the steps. "Did Caleb Rowland actually propose?" "Yes." "And you accepted?" "Yes." Mrs. Talbot's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, disbelief, something that might have been envy, and finally a sort of grudging acceptance. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. When's the wedding?" "Tomorrow morning." That brought the other boarding house residents rushing to the door, their faces alight with excitement and gossip hunger. Within seconds, Lydia was surrounded by questions and exclamations and demands for details she didn't have the energy to provide. "Tomorrow? That's impossibly soon. What will you wear? You can't get married in those old dresses. Have you even thought about flowers or a proper ceremony? What did he say when he proposed? Was it romantic?" Lydia held up her hands, desperate for quiet. "It's going to be a simple ceremony at the church. Mr. Rowland, Caleb, is making the arrangements. I'll wear what I have because it's all I have. And no, it wasn't romantic. It was practical and honest, which is exactly what I wanted." "But surely you want some kind of celebration," Mrs. Talbot pressed. "A wedding breakfast at least, or—" "What I want," Lydia interrupted, "is to go to my room and prepare for tomorrow. If you'll excuse me." She pushed past them and climbed the stairs, ignoring the whispered speculation that followed. In her small room, she lit the lamp and looked around at the space that had been her home for less than a week. Tomorrow night, she'd sleep in the ranch house as Caleb's wife. This room, this life, this version of herself who'd stood on platforms waiting to be chosen, all of it would be left behind. A knock on her door made her turn. Margaret Finch stood in the hallway, her expression complicated. "I heard the news," Margaret said quietly. "I wanted to congratulate you properly, away from the others." "Thank you." Lydia gestured her inside. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I know you were hoping—" "Don't." Margaret cut her off gently. "Don't apologize for being chosen. I was disappointed, yes, but I was also relieved. I don't think I could have handled what he was asking for. You're stronger than me, Lydia. You deserve this." "I don't know about deserve. I just said yes when given the chance." "That's more than I would have done." Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. "Can I ask you something? Are you scared?" Lydia considered lying, then decided Margaret deserved honesty. Terrified. "But you're doing it anyway." "Because the alternative is worse. Going back to being invisible, being rejected, having nothing, and being nothing." Lydia sat beside her. "At least this way, I'm choosing my future instead of having it chosen for me." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I think I'll take the westbound stage on Friday, try my luck in another town. Maybe I'll be as brave as you next time." "You're already brave. You came all this way, didn't you?" After Margaret left, Lydia spent hours trying to sleep and failing. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the boarding house settle around her, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. Marriage. A new name. A new home. A new life built on 3 days of acquaintance and one honest proposal. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to pale dawn light and Mrs. Talbot's knock on the door. "Miss Hart, there's a package here for you, delivered early this morning." Lydia opened the door to find Mrs. Talbot holding a large box wrapped in plain paper. Inside was a dress, simple but beautifully made, in a deep blue that would complement her coloring. A note was tucked inside in Caleb's angular handwriting. "Thought you might want something new for today. The seamstress says it should fit. If it doesn't, wear what you planned. Either way, I'll see you at the church at 10. See, Lydia held the dress against herself, feeling tears prick her eyes. It was practical and thoughtful, and exactly the kind of gesture she should have expected from Caleb, addressing a need without making a fuss about it. The dress fit almost perfectly, requiring only minor adjustments that Mrs. Talbot helped her make with surprising gentleness. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Talbot said, stepping back to examine her work. Truly lovely. Lydia studied herself in the small mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The blue dress brought color to her face, and her hair, carefully pinned by one of the other boarders, looked softer than usual. She didn't look young or particularly beautiful, but she looked like someone who belonged, like someone worthy of standing beside Caleb Rowland and claiming the title of his wife. Tom arrived at 9:30 with the wagon, dressed in his cleanest shirt and looking almost nervous. "You ready, ma'am?" "As ready as I'll ever be." The ride to the church felt both endless and too short. Lydia's hands trembled in her lap, and her heart hammered against her ribs. This was real. This was actually happening. In less than an hour, she would be married to a man she'd known for 3 days, bound to him and his ranch for the rest of her life. The church was already full when they arrived, packed with townspeople who'd come to witness the impossible. Caleb Rowland's wedding to the woman everyone had dismissed. Lydia felt their stares like physical weight as Tom helped her down from the wagon. Whispers followed her up the church steps. Can you believe it? 3 days and he's marrying her. What could she possibly have done to convince him? She must be carrying his child. That's the only explanation. Lydia lifted her chin and walked through the door. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. In a few minutes, none of it would matter because she would be Caleb's wife, and they would have to accept it. The church interior was simple but well-maintained, with wooden pews and tall windows that let in generous light. Caleb stood at the front beside the preacher, dressed in a dark suit that made him look both more civilized and somehow more intimidating. When he saw Lydia, something softened in his expression. He met her halfway down the aisle, offering his arm. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "The dress is perfect. Thank you." "I'm glad." He led her to the front of the church, and they stood together facing the preacher, a thin man with kind eyes who looked between them with barely concealed curiosity. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. No flowery promises of eternal love, no poetry about souls joining together, just the legal words that would bind them as husband and wife, spoken clearly and without embellishment. When the preacher asked if Lydia took Caleb as her husband, her voice rang out strong and certain. "I do." And when Caleb slipped a simple gold band onto her finger and repeated his own vows, his voice was equally steady. Then the preacher pronounced them married, and Caleb kissed her, a brief, chaste touch of lips that nevertheless sent heat flooding through Lydia's body. They were married. She was Lydia Rowland now. The woman who'd been rejected 7 times had just married the wealthiest man in 3 territories. The receiving line afterward was exhausting. Townspeople filed past, offering congratulations that ranged from genuine to grudging to outright skeptical. Women who'd ignored Lydia on the platform now smiled and called her Mrs. Rowland. Men who'd passed her by without a glance now shook her hand and wished her well. But not everyone was pleased. A severe-looking woman with silver hair approached them with ice in her eyes. "Caleb Rowland, you've made a fool's choice. That woman is far too old to give you healthy heirs, and everyone knows it. You'll regret this before the year is out." Caleb's expression went cold. "Mrs. Winters, you've never been shy about sharing your opinions, but this time you've crossed a line. Lydia is my wife now, and I won't tolerate disrespect toward her. If you can't offer genuine congratulations, you can leave." Mrs. Winters' face flushed scarlet. "Well, No, you never did know when to hold your tongue. Good day, Mrs. Winters." After the woman stalked away, Lydia touched Caleb's arm. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. You're a Rowland now, and Rowlands don't tolerate being disrespected." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "You'll face more of that. People who think they know better than us, who think I made a mistake. Can you handle it?" "I've been handling it my whole life. One more bitter woman won't break me." Ray appeared at Caleb's shoulder, grinning widely. "Boss, the men want to know if there's going to be a wedding breakfast at the ranch. Pete's standing by to cook if you give the word." Caleb looked at Lydia. "What do you think? Ready to face the ranch as its mistress?" Lydia thought about the long day ahead, about stepping into her new role with 32 pairs of eyes watching her every move. Then she thought about delaying it, about drawing out this moment of transition, and realized that would only make it harder. "Let's go home," she said. The word felt strange and perfect on her tongue. Home. After 12 years of boarding houses and rented rooms and temporary spaces, she finally had a home. The ranch was decorated when they arrived. Someone had strung up ribbons and wildflowers, and tables had been set up in the yard. The men had clearly been working all morning to prepare for this impromptu celebration. Pete had outdone himself with the food: roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, and 3 different kinds of pie. As Lydia and Caleb climbed down from the wagon, the ranch hands erupted into cheers and applause. Ray started a toast that quickly devolved into ribald jokes and good-natured teasing. Pete presented Lydia with a beautiful cake, its frosting carefully piped with flowers. "Thought you might want something sweet for your wedding day," he said gruffly. Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes again. These men, rough, hard-working cowboys who barely knew her, had done all this to welcome her home, to make her feel like she belonged. "Thank you," she managed. "Thank you all." The celebration lasted for hours. The men ate and drank and told stories about Caleb, sharing tales of his early days building the ranch and the various mishaps along the way. Lydia learned that he'd once tried to break a wild Mustang and ended up in the water trough, that he'd gotten lost on his own property during his first winter and had to follow his horse's instincts to find his way back, that he'd outbid 3 other ranchers for a prize bull and then discovered the animal was afraid of chickens. Caleb bore the storytelling with good humor, occasionally correcting details or adding his own embellishments. And through it all, he kept Lydia close, his hand on her back, his presence steady and grounding. As the sun began to set and the men started drifting back to their duties, Tom pulled Lydia aside. "The boss's bedroom is upstairs, second door on the right. We had one of the women from town come clean it proper this afternoon." He hesitated. "Ma'am, I just want to say, you're good for him. He's been alone too long, carrying too much weight by himself." I'm glad he found someone strong enough to help share the load. I hope I can live up to that, Tom. You already have, just by being here, by choosing this life. That took more courage than most people will ever have. After Tom left, Lydia found Caleb on the porch, watching the last of the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. He looked tired but content, more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. "Quite a day," she said, joining him at the railing. "Quite a day," he agreed. "How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure yet. Ask me again tomorrow when reality sets in." Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Lydia, I want you to understand something. This marriage is real. You're not just a housekeeper or a business partner. You're my wife, and this is your home now. Everything I have, everything I've built, it's ours now. That's a lot of trust to place in someone you've known for 3 days. I know, but I've been watching people for 42 years and I've gotten good at reading them. You're exactly who you presented yourself to be, honest, strong, capable, and stubborn as hell. Those aren't qualities I'm worried about. Those are qualities I need." Lydia looked out at the ranch spread before them, at the buildings and corrals and distant cattle that represented Caleb's life's work. "I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to fail at things. I'm going to need help. I know that too. But the difference between you and everyone else who wanted this life is that you're not afraid to admit it." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band on her finger. "We'll figure it out together. That's what partnerships are." The words settled into Lydia's chest alongside all the fear and hope and overwhelming responsibility. Partnership. Not romance, not rescue, but two people working together to build something bigger than either of them alone. "Should we go inside?" she asked quietly. Caleb's expression flickered with something she couldn't quite read. "Lydia, I want to be clear about expectations. This marriage is real, but I'm not going to rush the physical aspects. We barely know each other, and I won't pressure you into anything you're not ready for." Relief and something else, disappointment maybe, washed through her. "What are you suggesting?" "Separate bedrooms for now. Time to get to know each other without that complication." He squeezed her hand gently. "Unless you object." Lydia thought about it carefully. The truth was, she wasn't ready. Everything had happened so fast, and the thought of sharing Caleb's bed tonight, of that final intimacy with a man who was still mostly a stranger, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I don't object," she said. "Thank you for understanding. There's a guest room across from mine. It's yours for as long as you need it." He paused. "But Lydia, eventually I do want a real marriage, children, if we're blessed with them. A true partnership in every sense. I just don't see the point in forcing it before we're both ready." "That seems fair." They went inside together, and Caleb showed her to the guest room Tom had mentioned. It was simply furnished but clean and comfortable, with a large bed and windows overlooking the ranch. Her carpet bag, transported from the boarding house at some point during the day, sat on the dresser. "If you need anything, I'm right across the hall," Caleb said from the doorway. "Good night, Lydia." "Good night, Caleb." After he left, Lydia sat on the bed and looked around at the room that was now hers. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night, men's voices calling to each other, horses nickering in the barns, the distant lowing of cattle, sounds that would become the backdrop of her life. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into bed, exhausted beyond measure but unable to sleep. Her mind kept replaying the day, the ceremony, the celebration, the look in Caleb's eyes when he'd called her his wife. The weight of the gold band on her finger felt both foreign and right. Somewhere across the hall, Caleb was probably experiencing his own version of this surreal reality. He'd been alone for 42 years, and now he had a wife, a partner, someone who would share his burdens and his triumphs, his failures and his successes. Lydia wondered if he was as scared as she was, if he was lying awake wondering if he'd made the right choice, if this strange woman he'd plucked from a bride platform would actually be able to handle everything he needed from her. But then she remembered the way he'd defended her against Mrs. Winters, the dress he'd bought for her wedding, the separate bedroom he'd offered without making her ask. These weren't the actions of a man having doubts. These were the actions of a man who'd made his choice and was committed to seeing it through. She could do the same. She had to. because going back wasn't an option, and standing still meant dying slowly. The only direction was forward, into this new life with all its challenges and possibilities. Tomorrow, she would wake up as Lydia Rowland, mistress of the CR Ranch. She would begin learning to truly manage the household, to earn the respect of the men, to prove she deserved the position Caleb had given her. It would be hard. It would probably be the hardest thing she'd ever done. But for the first time in 12 years, Lydia felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She fell asleep with that thought wrapped around her like armor, protecting her from the doubts and fears that tried to creep in. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. Tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that she'd made it this far. She'd survived 7 rejections and chosen herself a future. Now all she had to do was prove she could live in it. The rooster's crow shattered Lydia's sleep before dawn had fully broken. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed was too soft, the room too large, the sounds outside too unfamiliar. Then memory crashed back. The ranch, the wedding, Caleb. She was Lydia Rowland now, and this was the first morning of her new life. She dressed quickly in one of her old work dresses, pinning her hair back with practiced efficiency. When she opened her bedroom door, she found Caleb already up, dressed for work, standing in the hallway as if he'd been waiting for her. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Thought we could have coffee together before the day starts. Once the men wake up, there won't be time for quiet." They sat together at the kitchen table as pale light crept through the windows. The coffee was strong and bitter, and the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Outside, the ranch was beginning to stir, horses moving in the corrals, the distant sound of men emerging from the bunkhouses. "Pete will expect you in the cook shack by 5:15, Caleb said. "Breakfast needs to be ready when the men arrive at 5:30. After that, you'll manage the household, cleaning, laundry, whatever needs doing. Lunch at noon, then the afternoon is yours to organize however you see fit. Supper at 6. And you?" "I'll be out with the men most days, checking fences, moving cattle, handling whatever problems come up." He studied her face. "I meant what I said yesterday. This is your home now. Run it however you think best. The men will adjust." Lydia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "What if they don't? What if I give orders and they refuse?" "They won't refuse. Not if the orders make sense." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "But if you run into real trouble, come find me. I'll handle it." The first week passed in a blur of exhaustion and constant learning. Lydia woke before dawn every morning and fell into bed after dark, her muscles screaming and her mind overwhelmed with everything she needed to remember. She learned the rhythm of ranch meals, simple, hearty, and plentiful. She learned which men preferred their coffee black and which ones needed it sweetened. She learned to manage the household budget, stretching supplies further than she'd thought possible while maintaining quality. But she also made mistakes. She burned an entire batch of biscuits her third day, forcing the men to eat bread instead. She miscalculated the laundry schedule and ran out of clean towels. She accidentally ordered twice as much flour as needed from the town merchant, throwing the monthly budget into chaos. Each failure felt like confirmation of what Mrs. Winters had said at the wedding, that she wasn't good enough, wasn't capable enough, wasn't worthy of being Caleb Rowland's wife. But Caleb never criticized. When she burned the biscuits, he ate the bread without comment. When she ran out of towels, he simply used his shirt to dry his hands. When she confessed the flour mistake, he looked at the numbers and said, "We'll use it eventually, just adjust next month's order." It was Pete who finally confronted her about the pattern of anxiety that was making her sloppy. "You're trying too hard," he said bluntly one afternoon when she was on the verge of tears over a collapsed pie crust. "You're so worried about being perfect that you're making yourself worse. Stop trying to prove something and just do the work." "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Like hell you're not. You're trying to prove to the boss that he didn't make a mistake. Trying to prove to the men that you deserve to be here. Trying to prove to yourself that you're good enough." Pete grabbed the ruined crust and threw it in the slop bucket. "But you're already here. You're already married. You already earned your place. Now stop acting like it's a test you can fail and start acting like it's a job you're learning." The words hit Lydia like cold water, shocking and clarifying. He was right. She'd been approaching every task like it was a trial, like one mistake would send her back to that platform waiting to be rejected again. But that wasn't how marriage worked. That wasn't how partnership worked. She started the pie crust over, this time with steady hands and a clearer mind. It came together perfectly. By the end of the second week, something began to shift. The men stopped watching her quite so intently, stopped waiting for her to fail. They started coming to her directly with small requests. Could she mend a torn shirt? Did she know where the boss kept the liniment for sore muscles? Would she ask Caleb about extending the fence line? Each request was a small vote of confidence, a recognition that she was becoming part of the ranch's fabric rather than just an outsider trying to fit in. Ray was particularly helpful, despite his initial skepticism. He taught her the names of all 32 men, their roles and quirks, and which ones needed gentle handling versus direct orders. He showed her the best routes around the property and warned her about the areas to avoid during certain weather. And one evening, he pulled her aside with unexpected seriousness. "Boss seems happier," Ray said without preamble. "Lighter, somehow. I've known him 15 years, and I've never seen him like this." "Like what?" "Like he's not carrying everything alone anymore." Ray studied her face. "That's what you're giving him, Lydia. Not a perfect household or flawless meals. You're giving him partnership, someone to share the weight with." The words stayed with Lydia through the days that followed. She started paying attention to Caleb in new ways, noticing when tension gathered in his shoulders, when worry creased his forehead, when exhaustion made his movements heavy, and she started speaking up about it. "What's wrong?" she asked one evening when he came in late with that particular set to his jaw that meant trouble. Caleb looked surprised by the question. "Lost 6 head to predators last night. Mountain lion, probably. We'll have to hunt it down before it develops a taste for cattle." "Is it dangerous? The hunt?" "Can be, but it has to be done." Lydia set down the dish she was washing and turned to face him fully. "Then be careful. I'd rather have you back in one piece than have you prove how brave you are." Something in Caleb's expression shifted, softened and opened in a way she'd never seen before. "I'll be careful," he promised. "For you." The third week brought the first real test of Lydia's authority. She'd asked one of the younger ranch hands, a cocky 20-year-old named Jake, to repair a broken gate near the main house. When she checked on it 3 hours later, he hadn't even started, too busy showing off for some of the other young men. Lydia felt her temper rise, sharp and hot. She'd dealt with men like Jake before, men who thought a woman's orders were suggestions to be ignored. She walked up to the group with her spine straight and her voice cold. "Jake, I asked you to fix that gate 3 hours ago. Why isn't it done?" Jake barely glanced at her. "I'll get to it when I get to it, ma'am." "You'll get to it now. The boss is bringing buyers through tomorrow, and he needs that gate functional." "Boss didn't say anything to me about it." Jake's tone was dismissive, deliberately disrespectful. The other men had gone quiet, watching to see how Lydia would handle this challenge to her authority. She could feel the weight of their attention, the test inherent in this moment. "I'm saying something to you about it," Lydia said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "And in case you've forgotten, when the boss isn't here, my word carries the same weight as his. Now you can fix that gate in the next hour, or you can explain to Caleb tonight why his wife's orders aren't worth following. Your choice." Jake's face flushed red. For a moment, Lydia thought he might refuse outright. Then Ray's voice cut across the tension. "I'd listen to her if I were you, Jake. Boss doesn't take kindly to his wife being disrespected. And even if he did, she's right about the buyers. That gate needs fixing." Jake stood abruptly, his jaw tight with barely suppressed anger. "Fine. I'll fix your damn gate." He stalked off toward the tool shed, radiating resentment. After the other men dispersed, Ray lingered. "That was well handled. You didn't back down, but you gave him a way to save face. Smart." "Will he hold a grudge?" "Probably, but he'll also think twice before ignoring you again." Ray grinned. "And if he doesn't, the boss will straighten him out permanently. Caleb doesn't tolerate disrespect toward you." That evening, Lydia mentioned the incident to Caleb as they reviewed the weekly accounts together. His expression went thunderous. "I'll talk to Jake tomorrow. Make it clear that kind of behavior isn't acceptable." "No," Lydia said firmly. "I handled it. If you step in now, it undermines my authority. The men need to see that I can manage problems myself." Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You're right. But if he gives you trouble again, I want to know about it." "I'll tell you. I promise." He reached across the desk and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You're doing well here, Lydia. Better than well. The men respect you, the household runs smoothly, and you haven't let the pressure break you. I'm proud of you. The words settled into Lydia's chest, warm and precious. In her entire life, she couldn't remember anyone saying they were proud of her. She'd been tolerated, sometimes appreciated, occasionally pitied, but never this, genuine pride from someone whose opinion mattered. Thank you, she managed, her voice thick. That means more than you know. As the fourth week began, Lydia realized she'd stopped counting days. The frantic need to prove herself was fading, replaced by the steady rhythm of ranch life. She woke before dawn without resentment, moved through her tasks with growing confidence, and fell asleep each night with the satisfaction of work well done. But something else was changing too. The careful distance she and Caleb had maintained was beginning to feel less comfortable and more like an obstacle. She found herself noticing small things about him, the way he smiled when one of his plans worked, the gentleness he showed with injured animals, the quiet pride he took in the ranch he'd built. She noticed the way he watched her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression that made her pulse quicken. They'd been married a month when the first real crisis hit. A late spring storm rolled in with almost no warning, bringing driving rain and winds strong enough to tear roofing off the barns. Caleb and the men worked frantically to secure the buildings and move the cattle to shelter, while Lydia battled to keep the main house from flooding and prepared hot food and coffee for when the exhausted men stumbled in from the storm. The worst of it hit around midnight. Lydia was alone in the kitchen when she heard the crash, wood splintering somewhere outside. She grabbed a lantern and ran to the window, peering through the rain-lashed glass. One of the storage sheds had collapsed, its contents spilling across the muddy yard. She didn't think, just acted. She pulled on Caleb's spare coat and ran outside into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet, and rain pelted her face hard enough to sting. But she could see barrels rolling away, tools scattering, supplies they couldn't afford to lose. She was trying to drag a barrel back toward shelter when strong hands grabbed her shoulders and spun her around. Caleb stood there, soaked and furious, shouting to be heard over the wind. "What are you doing out here? Get back inside!" "The shed collapsed. We're losing supplies." "I don't care about the supplies. You could get hurt." "So could you," Lydia shouted back. "But you're out here anyway because the work needs doing. Same as me." They stood there in the driving rain, staring at each other, and something fundamental shifted between them. This wasn't the careful partnership they'd been maintaining. This was raw and real and utterly honest. Two people fighting the same battle on the same side. Caleb's expression changed, the anger burning away to leave something else. He pulled her close, sheltering her from the worst of the wind, and pressed his forehead to hers. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I learned from the best," she said, and kissed him. It wasn't gentle or romantic. It was fierce and desperate, and tasted like rain and mud and complete honesty. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb's eyes were blazing. "Inside, now! We'll handle the supplies together after the storm passes." They worked side by side for the rest of the night, securing what they could and accepting what they'd lost. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the ranch battered but intact. Lydia and Caleb stood in the muddy yard, exhausted and filthy, surveying the damage. "Could have been worse," Caleb said finally. "Could have been better." He laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "That's one way to look at it." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Lydia, I think we're past the point of separate bedrooms. Unless you disagree." Lydia thought about the month they'd spent carefully maintaining distance, building partnership without intimacy. Then she thought about last night, the kiss in the rain, the feeling of fighting beside him rather than behind him, the moment she'd stopped being his employee, masquerading as a wife, and become his actual partner. "I don't disagree," she said quietly. That night, Lydia moved her belongings into Caleb's room. It was larger than the guest room, with the windows on two sides and a bed big enough for two people who'd stopped pretending they didn't want to share it. They came together slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies the same way they'd learned each other's minds, with patience and honest communication and the understanding that partnership meant being vulnerable together. Afterward, lying in Caleb's arms with her head on his chest, Lydia felt something slot into place. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Not just shared work or mutual respect, But this, complete trust and genuine intimacy, and the bone-deep knowledge that you'd chosen the right person. I love you, Caleb said into the darkness, his voice quiet but certain. I didn't expect to. Didn't think I was capable of it anymore. But I do. Lydia lifted her head to look at him, seeing in his storm-gray eyes the same truth she felt burning in her own chest. I love you too. Probably have since you defended me against Mrs. Winters, if I'm honest. He laughed and pulled her closer. That was the moment, was it? That was when I knew you saw me as yours to protect, not just as an employee or a convenience, but as someone who mattered to you. You matter more than you know. The months that followed were not easy. Ranch life never was. They faced droughts and predators, difficult buyers and equipment failures, the endless small crises that came with managing such a vast operation. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. Lydia proved herself in ways that surprised even her. When rustlers tried to steal cattle, she rode out with the men and stood guard with a loaded rifle. When disease threatened the herd, she worked alongside the veterinarian for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, until the outbreak was contained. When Caleb had to travel to negotiate a major cattle sale, she ran the entire ranch for 2 weeks and had everything running smoothly when he returned. The men's respect evolved from grudging acceptance to genuine admiration. Ray told anyone who'd listened that Lydia Rowland was tougher than most men and smarter than all of them. Pete claimed her biscuits were finally better than his, which everyone knew was the highest praise he'd ever given. Tom said she had the mind of a banker and the heart of a rancher, which made her the perfect match for the boss. But it was the townspeople's reaction that surprised Lydia most. The same women who'd whispered about her at the wedding began seeking her advice. The merchants who'd been skeptical started treating her with the respect due to the wife of the territory's wealthiest rancher. Even Mrs. Winters eventually approached her at the general store with stiff apology. I was wrong about you, Mrs. Rowland. I thought Caleb had made a fool's choice, but clearly he saw something the rest of us missed. Lydia could have been gracious. Should have been, probably. But she'd spent too many years being gracious to people who dismissed her. He saw exactly what I showed him on that platform, Mrs. Winters. Strength and honesty and refusal to give up. The fact that everyone else was too busy looking at age and appearance to notice says more about them than it does about me. Mrs. Winters' face tightened, but she nodded. Perhaps you're right. In any case, I wish you and Caleb well. 6 months after the wedding, Lydia realized she was pregnant. The discovery sent her into a spiral of fear and joy so intense she could barely breathe. At 32, pregnancy carried risks she understood all too well. But the thought of giving Caleb a child, of building the family they both wanted, outweighed the fear. She told him that evening on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of gold and purple. I'm pregnant. Caleb went very still. Then he pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. Are you sure? As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor, but I know my body, and I know the signs. He pulled back to look at her face, his expression cycling through joy and terror and fierce protectiveness. We'll get the best doctor. We'll take every precaution. You'll rest more, work less. Caleb. Lydia placed her hand over his mouth, gentle but firm. I'm pregnant, not fragile. I'll be careful, but I'm not stopping work. The ranch needs me, and I need the work. But the risks are the same whether I work or sit idle. Actually, probably higher if I sit idle and go mad from boredom. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Can you just be happy about that for a minute before you start worrying? Caleb's face transformed, worry giving way to pure joy. We're going to have a baby, he repeated, wonder in his voice. You're going to be a mother. I'm going to be a father. He kissed her softly, tenderly. I'm terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Good. That means you understand what we're getting into. The pregnancy was difficult. Lydia suffered through months of morning sickness that wasn't limited to mornings, exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel monumental, and fear that something would go wrong. But she also felt the baby move, saw Caleb's face light up when he felt the kicks, and daydreamed about the future they were building. When her time came, it was long and brutal, and 30 hours of labor that left her screaming and certain she would die. Caleb stayed with her the entire time, holding her hand and wiping her face and promising her over and over that she was strong enough to do this. And she was. At dawn on a cool autumn morning, 8 months after she'd stood on that platform waiting to be chosen, Lydia gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas, after the foreman who'd been the first to welcome her, and Caleb wept when he held his son for the first time. "Thank you," he whispered to Lydia as she lay exhausted in their bed. "Thank you for choosing this life, for choosing me, for giving me more than I ever dared hope for." Lydia looked at her husband and her son, at the life they'd built together from nothing but honesty and hard work and stubborn determination. "I should be thanking you. You're the one who saw something worth choosing when everyone else looked right past me. I saw a partner. I was right." The years that followed brought 2 more children, daughters who inherited Lydia's stubbornness and Caleb's gray eyes. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under their joint management. They added more land, improved the cattle bloodlines, built new facilities, and created a legacy that would outlast them both. But Lydia's proudest achievement came 5 years after her wedding. She opened a small school on ranch property, offering education to the children of ranch families and neighboring homesteads. It started with just 6 students crammed into a converted storage building. Within 3 years, they'd built a proper schoolhouse, hired 2 teachers, and were educating 30 children from across the territory. "Why a school?" one of the visiting cattlemen asked during a dinner at the ranch. "What does education have to do with raising beef?" Lydia exchanged glances with Caleb before answering. "Everything. This ranch will outlast us. Our children and their children will inherit it, but they can only build on what we've started if they have the knowledge and skills to do it. Education isn't separate from ranching. It's the foundation that makes everything else possible." The cattleman looked skeptical, but his wife, a sharp-eyed woman who reminded Lydia of herself, nodded thoughtfully. "That's wise thinking, Mrs. Rowland. My own children could benefit from such a school." "Then send them. We have room." The school became one of the most respected in the territory. Children who attended went on to manage their own ranches, become doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves, build businesses and families and futures that rippled outward like stones thrown in a pond. And every one of them knew the story of how their school came to be, because Mrs. Rowland, who'd been rejected 7 times before finding her place, refused to let anyone else go through life without opportunities. 10 years after the wedding, Lydia stood on the porch of the ranch house watching her children play in the yard. Thomas was 8 now, serious and thoughtful like his father. The twins, Mary and Catherine, were 6 and wild as spring storms. Inside, Caleb was reviewing accounts with Tom, their voices a comfortable rumble through the open windows. Ray approached from the barns, moving slower these days, but still sharp as ever. "Afternoon, boss lady. Kids wearing you out?" "Always," Lydia smiled. "But I wouldn't have it any other way." "Hard to believe it's been 10 years since you stood on that platform." Ray leaned against the porch railing. "Town's still talking about it, you know. How the boss walked past everyone and chose you." "Let them talk. They'll never understand it anyway." "What's to understand? He needed a partner. You needed a home. You built something real together." Ray tipped his hat. "Seems pretty straightforward to me." After he left, Lydia thought about those words. 10 years ago, she'd stood invisible and unwanted, watching other women get chosen while she faced rejection after rejection. She'd been 31 years old and convinced her life was over before it had really begun. But Caleb had seen something different. He'd seen strength and honesty and the stubborn refusal to give up. He'd offered her not rescue, but partnership, not romance, but real work and real purpose. And she'd built a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. Not because she was rescued or saved, but because she'd been given the chance to prove what she'd always known about herself, that she was strong enough, smart enough, stubborn enough to build something that mattered. The door opened behind her and Caleb stepped out, sliding his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" "The platform, the wedding, how far we've come." "Regrets?" Lydia laughed. "Not even one. You?" "Only that I waited so long to find you." He kissed her temple. "Though I suppose it worked out how it was meant to." We found each other when we were both ready. They stood together watching the sunset over the ranch they'd built, the children they'd raised, the life they'd created from one honest choice on a dusty platform 10 years ago. Somewhere in town, young women were probably still standing on platforms hoping to be chosen. Somewhere, men were walking past perfectly good partners because they were too focused on age or beauty to see strength. But that wasn't Lydia's story anymore. Her story was this: the ranch spreading before her, the children playing in the yard, the man holding her close, and the partnership they'd forged in honesty and hard work. She'd been rejected 7 times, but on the 8th chance, someone had finally seen her for who she really was. And together they'd built something worth far more than she'd ever dreamed possible when she'd stood invisible and unwanted, waiting for someone to give her a chance. Not rescue, not romance, just the opportunity to prove what she'd always known, that she was enough exactly as she was. And in the end, that had been worth every rejection, every moment of doubt, every fear that she'd never find her place in the world. Because she had found it. Not by changing who she was, but by finding someone who valued who she'd always been. And that, Lydia thought as Caleb's arms tightened around her and their children's laughter filled the evening air, was the only ending her story could have ever needed.